At dawn, on an April morning in 1943, with the Second World War at its height, a young Spanish fisherman spotted a strange object floating in the water here off the south coast of Spain. As he rowed closer, he saw it was the body of a dead man. The corpse was wearing a life jacket over a British uniform. A briefcase, attached to the wrist by a chain, was floating alongside him. The face had begun to rot, and the stench was overpowering. The fisherman hauled the body onto his boat, believing he had found a casualty of war. In fact, he had just set in train Operation Mincemeat, a deception plan that would change the course of the Second World War.
We all were terrified by the Official Secrets Act and thought we'd end up in the Tower of London if we gave anything away.
My father used to say, it brought out his natural bent towards criminality and deception.
Extraordinary story. My husband was always furious that he knew nothing about it.
Were you sworn to secrecy?
Well, everything was sworn to secrecy. We were rather good secret keepers.
In 1943, the men and women in this subterranean room began work on an extraordinary plan, inspired by none other than Ian Fleming, a young intelligence officer who would go on to create James Bond. 3 years earlier, Fleming had worked on a list of 51 suggestions for deceiving the enemy, including schemes too outlandish even for 007. Number 28 on the list was headed a suggestion, not a very nice one. A corpse, dressed as an airman with dispatches in his pockets, could be dropped on the coast. There is no difficulty in obtaining corpses, but of course, it would have to be a fresh one. This was the sort of idea that Winston Churchill loved. He deliberately encouraged spies with corkscrew minds because he knew that Hitler thought in straight lines. British spy masters had a low opinion of their German counterparts, regarding them as dull, humourless and predictable. Early in 1943, that opinion would be put to the test. After 3 years of fierce fighting, the Nazis still occupied most of Europe and vast territories in the Soviet Union. Hitler remained convinced that world domination still lay within his grasp. What the Allies now needed was a breakthrough. The first crucial step would be an invasion of Sicily. Thousands of British and American troops were now massing in North Africa for the attack. Victory in Sicily would punch into the enemy's soft underbelly in Europe. It might turn the tide of the war. But there was a problem. As Churchill put it, anyone but a bloody fool would know it was Sicily. The island was the obvious target, and the Germans knew it. It would need a deception of staggering daring to convince them otherwise. The job of British intelligence was to convince the Germans that instead of attacking Sicily, the target was Greece. Suddenly, Ian Fleming's mad idea seemed almost sane. There were two men who were perfect for this sort of scheme. They worked at the heart of British intelligence. One, an RAF pilot who didn't fly, and the other, a Royal Naval commander who didn't go to sea. Together, they would assemble the plan of planting fake documents on a corpse and find a way of getting it to the Germans. Churchill had his corkscrew thinkers. Charles Cholmondeley was a 25-year-old Air Force officer with a magnificent waxed moustache and a very peculiar mind. In his spare time, he studied the mating habits of insects and hunted partridge with a revolver.
I'd spoken to him several times on the telephone in my work. I was working for MI6 and he was in MI5. And one day, by mistake, I sent him the wrong papers. They were top secret, and I had to get them back somewhere, and I was terribly worried about this. And so I rang him up and said, "I'm terribly sorry, I've sent you these wrong papers. What shall I do?" And he suggested that I met him outside the Piccadilly Hotel and had dinner with him one evening. I was just standing there waiting on the pavement outside the hotel for a minute or two, and I saw this very tall man who later described himself as toothpaste squeezed out from the tube. He said, "My name is Chumley, spelt Cholmondley. And he always said, "Charles Chumley, Cholmondley." He just seemed happy, very pleased and happy with life, as if life was one big adventure.
Chumley was joined by Ewan Montague, a bold and ambitious naval intelligence officer. As a brilliant barrister before the war, Montague could see inside the minds of his opponents and exploit their weaknesses ruthlessly.
He wanted to go to sea because he joined the supplementary reserve. He wanted to go to sea. And then they found out that he was a lawyer and an eminent barrister. And so they whipped him out of that and shot him off up to naval intelligence, because that sort of mind is trained to cut through deception. But of course that's part of the job. You deceive and you identify deception.
He was delightful. He was enormously tall, had enormous feet, and he used to lope around and you'd see the feet long before you saw his head. He wanted everything done at once, and of course that was one of the secrets of his success.
Montague ran the counter-espionage unit in naval intelligence. Housed in a stuffy, smoky underground room deep inside the Admiralty, the members of Section 17M spent their days gathering and analysing enemy intelligence.
It was really a small room. We were sometimes 12 people in that room. And there were I think there were air for 6. And we had this fluorescent lighting which made everyone look blue. And people were allowed to smoke. It was just a sea of smoke at times. On Ewan's desk and on one or two of the other desks in the room there was what called scrambler telephones. So you get a call in, and if you wanted to talk something secret, you'd say, "Shall we scramble?" Press a button, and the whole conversation would be scrambled up, so no spy could hear it. Ewan Montague and Charles Chumley, they thought of absolutely everything. And they could look round corners in a way that most people's minds don't go round corners.
The invasion of Sicily was set for July 1943. That gave Montague and Chumley just 3 months to find a dead body, dress it up as a British officer, plant false documents on it, and leave it somewhere where the Germans would find it. You might think that finding a dead body in the middle of the Second World War would be pretty easy. In fact, finding the right sort of body would prove extremely tricky.
The most suitable sort of body would be somebody who'd perhaps drowned or who had died an accidental death, had the sort of injuries that would be in keeping with an aircraft that had ditched and then somebody had been injured and then drowned or succumbed to their injuries when in the water.
There was one man in wartime Britain with an almost inexhaustible supply of dead bodies. He went by the delightfully Dickensian name of Sir Bentley Purchase. As the coroner of St Pancras, he was in charge of the largest mortuary in the country.
Sir Bentley Purchase knew more about death than any man living, and he found every aspect of death extremely amusing. When Montague asked to come and see him, Purchase replied with complicated directions to the mortuary But then he added, an alternative method of getting here is, of course, to get run over.
Montague asked the coroner to keep an eye open for a suitable corpse. Sir Bentley Purchase was only too happy to oblige.
Bentley Purchase would have a large number of people coming through his jurisdiction, much the same as it would be now. The problem would be finding a body which could be used for that purpose.
Perhaps the saddest chapter in Operation Mincemeat begins in a grim Welsh mining town. Aberbargoed was built on coal. When the coal ran out, there was nothing left. It was here that a man called Glyndwr Michael was born. His father, an unemployed coal miner, stabbed himself in the throat when Glyn was 15 years old. The young boy signed his death certificate. It is the only example of his handwriting that exists. He was barely literate. His mother died in 1940. Alone in the world, his mind beginning to disintegrate, Glyndwr drifted to London. In January 1943, homeless, penniless and friendless, Glyndwr Michael killed himself with rat poison in a disused warehouse near King's Cross. He was 34 years old. He died unloved and unlamented, but not unnoticed. Here's the entry. Glyndwr Michael. 34, male, lunatic, phosphorus poisoning taken orally, suicide. Here was the perfect candidate. Sir Bentley Purchase was waiting at the morgue. Glyndwr Michael had no family. There were no physical marks on him. Above all, he had died in the right way. Bentley Purchase was adamant the poison would never show up in an autopsy. The body could be made to look as if it had died at sea after an air crash.
The team who were dealing with the operation had been informed that somebody who died of white phosphorus poisoning, of essentially rat poisoning, would be good for this sort of operation, and that the state of pathology at that time was such that they wouldn't be able to detect any inconsistencies between the reality of this man's death and the story that was being spun about it.
At last, Montague and Cholmondeley had their body, but they still needed a code name. All this talk of corpses was having an effect, and so they settled on a name that reflected their black sense of humour. Operation Mincemeat. The two men now began to invent an entirely new personality. The more believable they could make him, the more likely the Germans were to swallow the bait. And so, over the next 2 months, with the body securely locked inside the refrigerator, they set their imaginations to work to create a fiction so dazzling that the Germans would accept it as truth. Almost as if they were putting on a show. From the tragic life of Glyndwr Michael, they decided to forge a doomed hero. First, their character needed a name. Glyndwr Michael was erased from history. In his place was William Martin, a major in the Royal Marines, an officer, a gentleman, and the sort of chap who could be entrusted with top-secret documents, even if he died in the process, which he would. Getting hold of the right uniform was easy. Far more tricky was finding the right underwear. Help came from an unexpected quarter. During the war, everything